Hobbelink is an agronomist by training. In the 1980s, he worked with farmers in Peru on sustainable pest management. And after that, he worked with Dutch and European NGOs, drawing attention to the importance of agricultural biodiversity for the future of farming. In 1990, he co-founded Grain with Renée Vellvé, and over the past three decades has helped the organization grow into an international collective that works to support small farmers and social movements in their struggles for community-controlled and biodiversity-based food systems. Henk is the coordinator of Grain, and as such is responsible for the overall functioning and funding of the organization, as well as conducting research, writing, and outreach activities. Thank you, Henk. Take it away, please. Thanks.
Thank you so much for having me here in your convention, in your conference. Indeed, I'm Henk Hobbelink. I'm with Grain, and Grain basically is a bit like ETC and an international organization focusing on the analysis of the food system, and especially looking at the role of the corporations, the big agribusiness and other corporations, and how they affect farming and the food system across the world. We are a small team of some 14, 15 people, and we are a very spread out organization with actually most of our staff. I'm based in Barcelona here in Spain, but most of our staff is actually spread around the world, and especially in the regions where we focus our attention, which is in Latin America and Africa and Asia. But we also have staff in Canada, for example. Some of you might know Devlin Kuyek, who's based in Montreal, and in other places in the world. So we work sort of like in a network mode to sort of, which allows us to connect to many people. And we also collaborate a lot with Via Campesina and with some of the national farmers unions across the world. So what I would like to do is, in the 20 minutes I have, is to just quickly walk through a bit to talk about what the corporate concentration. And on one hand, I would like to sort of share a bit about who benefits from in the food system from this concentration, and also from the food crisis as we now have it. And then later on, I would like to go a bit more into detail also about one of the aspects which we have been working quite a lot on, and we are very concerned about, is the role of the industrial food system on the climate crisis, which we think isn't talked about enough about. So basically, to start off, as everybody knows, and you farmers better than we, is that we are suffering quite a deep food crisis, with especially the prices of food and fertilizers raising a lot. The simple explanation of that food crisis often is blamed on the war and the invasion of Ukraine, which cut off supply for the basic inputs for fertilizers, and also some of the flows of the commodities and of the food the food commodities in there, which are being exported to the rest of the world. But the problem is much deeper, and we did some research, and our conclusion, I don't want to go too deep into this, is a lot of it has to do with speculation, where which Kavya talked already a bit about, but it's clearly one of the issues where companies which have nothing to do with farming are speculating on high food prices and are getting very rich on it. This is a slide we made almost 25 years ago. Remember the last food crisis, 2008? We also looked at who is benefiting from the food crisis. Then also the prices were sky high. The problems was many people in the world were suffering. And if you look at this graph, the yellow bars, these are the three major pesticides companies. Here we have Cargill, ADM, and Bunge, the food companies, the food processing companies, and here are the three main input companies, Monsanto, Syngenta, and Bayer. And you see that the last graph, 2008 graph, the 2008 bars are huge, have grown a lot over compared to the previous years. And these are the annual profits of these companies in US dollars, US million dollars. It's clear it is a very similar situation today. We haven't had the time yet to look at. We haven't had the data yet to actually make the similar graph now for this year. But there is this one research from some partner of ours in Germany who looked at the fertilizer industry and how their profits have been increasing since last year. So this graph shows the profits of the companies, the income, sorry, of the companies in the first quarter of 2022 this year compared to those of the first quarter of last year. And it's very clear how the again also this year the profits from these different companies, in this case the fertilizer companies, have been huge. So one could argue that it's these companies who are actually mostly benefiting from the food crisis. Actually, in the case of Yara, we just learned today that Yara is paying out extra dividends to its shareholders because their profits now in the third quarter are much higher than expected. They had expected to earn something like 700,000 or 600 something thousand million dollars, and they'll end up they will in the third quarter they ended up having a benefit of $1 billion. So it shows how skewed in a way who benefits really from this crisis. It's obvious that the farmers don't benefit from this. And part of the reason for that is Katie asked me whether we could look a bit on like what is the value of the farmer's input into the food system. You know, how much value of that value is generated, the price is being paid on the farm, and how much is benefited is generated later in the food system. And I looked up some of the figures, and yeah, it's clear that today 85% of the value of the food system, especially in the more industrialized food system, the global food system, 85% of the value is actually generated by corporations after the food leaves the farm. So only 15% or less, some other data show less, actually 15% of the value of the food accrues to farmers, ends up in the hands of farmers. And that share actually has been decreasing over time. Between 2005 and 2015, that share of the farmers have in the value of food has shrunk by 1/3. If you look at why that happens, is some argue that over the time period, people eat less at home, and if you go eat outside, of course, you end up paying more, and also the restaurants and the food industry captures more of the benefits. In 1960, 95% of the people were eating at home, and in the 2000s, that had dropped to 72%. But another reason is the increase in the increased use and consumption of highly processed food over the last decades. Even I found it staggering that less than 60% of the home eating, the people who actually eat at home, is cooked at home. So these are people who buy already in the shop the highly processed food and just put it in the microwave to eat it at home. So there's little, even each time less and less home cooking being done with natural ingredients. This is a graph which sort of tries to picture where actually the $1 you spend in a grocery shop, where that money ends up, who benefits from it. And you see here that according to this calculation, it's less than 7.8 cents. So it's less than 8% of what consumers spend on food in the grocery ends up with the farmers. There's a lot. It shows how for example, of course, the food services, the restaurants, etc., they capture a big share of it, but also the food processing and the retail and the trade are dominant, in who actually capture most of the value of the value that the consumer pays for the food. So I think it paints a picture where increasingly the farmers receive less and less from the produce they produce and they sell, and their share in the overall food system becomes less and less, which I think is very worrying. Just a few words on the climate crisis. As you might know, the global food system, and I would stress this is mostly the global industrial food system, is responsible for over a third of all the emissions, of all the climate emissions. And a lot of that comes actually from fertilizer, nitrogen fertilizer. 2.4% of all the global emissions come from fertilizer. And if you look only at emissions from agriculture, it's this figure here on the graph, 21.5% come from agriculture. So almost 1/5 of all the emissions from agriculture come from fertilizers. And that's in one part because how they are produced. They are produced from natural gas, which was the reason why there was all the concerns that about the supply of fertilizers would be cut off because of the war. But actually, the major part of the emissions from fertilizer come from their use on the soil. Has a graph who shows that a bit what happens with the fertilizer, what the emissions from agriculture comes from sort of in the different sector. There's a lot of talk about the burps of the cows and the methane from the enteric fermentation of the cattle, which indeed is important. But again, there we have to relativize that a bit because the cows have been around since ever, and we don't have a climate crisis since ever. There could be a bit of an argument about how many cows we have in the world, and whether there's a debate about whether that should or should not lower. But if you look at this graph, it's actually the nitrous oxide from fertilizers and the fertilizer production who are together the major reason for the emissions from farming. This is a graph done by some Swedish researchers who looked at which countries are these emissions coming from, and you'll see Canada is actually one of the countries which is on the top there, together with Australia and the United States and France. But I think it's important to stress that the issue here is not so much the use of fertilizers by itself, but as Darren Qualman was actually saying a few days ago in an interview, it's really the problem is the overuse of fertilizers, and we have to look at ways how we can actually use fertilizers in a better way. And I think I would argue also that in the longer run, we have to look at how we can actually get to an agriculture, to farming systems, and to create and develop fertilizer which don't necessarily come from fossil fuels, and which is entirely possible. Just a bit more about the companies. This is a graph we did together with ITP and in some groups in Germany, who looked at the role of the big meat and dairy companies in the emissions, in greenhouse gas emissions. And our conclusion was, when we look at all these 15, I don't know how many. And it's about 15 companies. You have the big emitters there, GBS, Tyson, I'm sure you know the names, Cargill, Dairy Farmers of Africa, etc. This is a global picture, but together all these companies emit more greenhouse gases than all of Germany. And I think that's an important thing also to see if we talk about climate crisis in farming. We shouldn't just look and discuss, what the role of farmers, on the ground is in the contribution to the climate crisis, but we have to look especially to the corporations and their role and responsibilities there. Just a few last words. The corporations actually, basically, initially, they just played the denial role. They were saying, "No, this is not, there's no connection here." There's no problems there, and we don't really have a role in the whole climate in the climate discussion. But more recently, in the last few years, they have become actually quite active. And what many of the corporations now are doing is they present their what they call their net zero plans in terms of emissions. And they say, many of the companies who do this, I mean, many of them don't. They also they are completely on the sideline. But some of the most known companies have come with their plans on how they will reduce their contribution to the climate crisis. And the net zero game, as I would call it, is what they do is they promise, rather than saying, okay, the fertilizers, the whatever, the meat, or whatever the things we produce, highly emitting produce, we will reduce those, or we will lower the production of those. No, what they actually do is they continue to grow. Their plans to grow into with their produce will go unabated, but they promise that they will offset these emissions. They will continue with their emission, but they will offset them by planting trees or protecting forests elsewhere. And if we started sort of adding up the numbers of each of these companies, of these companies together, and for example, here I put in the example of Nestle. Nestle promised to be net zero by 2050, but it plans to increase its sales of meat and dairy by 68% by 2030, so they will grow tremendously. But to neutralize them, and to reach net zero, they would need to plant, in our calculations, about 4.4 million hectares of trees every year. And that's the size, it's more than the size of its home country, Switzerland. So imagine if these plans were actually, there's one question there, if these plans were realistic, which they aren't, they would actually result in an enormous new land grab trend, because these trees will not be planted in Canada. These trees will be planted on land in Brazil and in Africa and other places where, again, many farmers are now making their living. So rather than these net zero debates, rather than actually helping us to get out of the crisis, they are more of a smokescreen to let the companies continue polluting, and to actually put the blame and put a negative impact on others. So these are clearly not solutions, these corporate, what the companies come with. They're a smokescreen to continue to pollute the atmosphere. And yes, as Javier was saying before, we need to move to real solutions such as agroecology and food sovereignty, which Via Campesina and many other organizations are promoting. So I would like to leave it here and look forward to a good discussion.
Thank you so much, Henk. It's I think we all know some of these threats to food sovereignty and some of the things we like to do, but it's really nice to see some of the data and your analysis.